In this final part of my shed extension series, I'll add a roof, wall panels, and a door. In part 1, I poured the foundation wall and added a paver floor, and in part 2, I built the wall framing and added rafters. Before I add the plywood roof sheathing over the rafters, I'll add some vents. Drilling these holes is easier to do now before the roofing goes up. I bought some round plastic vent covers that slip into the holes made with a hole saw, and for these I drilled from both sides. The shed will need some air movement, especially in the summers. It's a non-insulated space, so it could really warm up. And I decided to vent the space this way instead of adding a soffit with vents. Seems easier and probably close to as effective. Also, before the roof sheathing goes on, I decided to prime and paint the gable overhang rafters, along with the rafter tails and blocking. Where the plywood sheathing is exposed, I'll also roll on some primer and paint. Easier to paint and seal this over a sawhorse than overhead. With trim screws, I can attach the fascia to the rafter tails. I made this fascia from some of the 1x8 foundation form lumber. Just needed some sanding, primer, and paint. Later, I'll add an eaves trough. And I can now slide the sheathing up over the rafters. My roof is exactly 16 feet long, so the first two were full sheets, and the third was also a full sheet. I attached all these plywood sheets to the rafters using screws. And the fourth sheet was cut in two, and a half dropping in on each end of that third sheet. Under the existing shed soffit, I'll need 2 strips of plywood to finish off the roof sheathing. For exhaust vents, I'll drill holes in these strips, 1 hole centered between each rafter. And I'll tack on some bug screen. Under the soffit where I couldn't reach to run in a screw, the ends of the plywood need to be secured to the rafters. I'll screw in some small angle brackets here. Now I can slide in the plywood strips. These were also held in place with small angle brackets. Over this plywood sheathing, I'll roll on a synthetic roofing felt. This was tacked on with roofing nails. I'll mark and then I'll cut the metal roofing sheets with an attachment on my drill. I think these powered metal shears are a must-have for doing this type of long cut. I'll square this first piece to the roof and screw it into place. I have a piece of flashing that will be set in place on the ends of the middle roofing panels. The middle panels I had cut a few inches shorter to allow for ventilation, so the roofing would not cover my screened vent holes under the soffit. This flashing should help stop any rain if the wind blows it up under the soffit. I'm not a roofer, so I'm sure there's a number of ways to vent this extension, but I figured this was an easy way to do this and allow the air to move freely from between the rafters on the high end of the roof. Here you can see where the ends of the panels butt into this flashing. I used some silicone to hold this flashing in place. There seems to be differing opinions on the placement of screws for these metal roofing sheets. Some say the screws should be placed in the tops of the ribs, and some say they should be placed on the flats like I do. For me, it seems to be much easier to place them on the flats. I also use a marking stick and a Sharpie to mark the location of the screws, so they're all spaced uniformly. As you can see these screw heads, it just looks better, in my opinion, when they are equally spaced in rows. Again, that's just me. Like the first piece, the last one needed to be ripped down to size before screwing it to the sheathing. Felt really good to have all those panels screwed in so I could move on to finishing the walls. Before the wall panels go up, I'll staple tar paper to the studs. I roll out the first piece, hold it in place, and secure with a hand stapler. My understanding here is it's the tar paper, or synthetic membrane or house wrap, that makes the walls waterproof, and not just the siding alone. The second piece overlaps the first. I got a slightly cleaner cut running the saw on the backside, but the cuts I did later from the other side look good too. These panels are grooved and primed, and I'll attach them with galvanized nails. They overlap at the edges and go up pretty fast. The only trick is holding them in place while I get the first few nails in. If I was going to do this again, I'd probably just use trim screws, or pull out my air nailer, but I'm not sure if I'd get the nails right in the vertical grooves of the panels. With this long straight wall and no windows, banging up these panels didn't take a lot of time. The nails hammered into a groove were finished off with a nail set. The pieces for the end walls were a bit more challenging to cut with the slope angle of the roof, and I wanted them to tuck up under the overhang and attach to the second rafter. The inside and outside corners of these walls will get a bead of caulking before I roll on the final coat of paint. The extension will have a steel door, but I will need to cut it down to fit the rough opening. I pulled the door pins and removed the slab. Then I'll mark the cut locations on the jamb. Then remove the screws from the threshold and set it aside. To cut the metal slab, I'll swap circular saw blades for a carbide finishing blade. I set the depth of the blade to half the thickness of the door and run the saw against a guide. I wore a little extra protection as the hot metal shavings from the cut are quite dangerous, and quite painful too. And I'll flip the slab and repeat on the other side. After deburring the sharp cut edge with a file, I'll make some cuts into the foam core. My blade length here is equal to the plastic piece that I cut off. I need to insert it back into the bottom between the metal faces. I'll clean out that foam with a chisel, then add some dabs of construction adhesive. Then slide that into place, clamp it, and run in a screw from either end while the glue sets up. Now the door jamb ends are cut with a circular saw. And then I'll also need to make an angled cut on each side to fit the threshold back in place. And that was easier to do with a handsaw. I copied the pilot hole locations from the cut ends of the jamb, then these screws would run into the holes in the metal threshold and everything would line up well. Some silicone will seal and hold the threshold to the concrete. I'll plumb the door frame and screw it to the studs. I added some small blocks of the siding panels to help line up the door jamb so it would be flush with the panels later. Now to hang the door slab and tap in the hinge pins. I can't say that this part of the project was very much fun. I found cutting this door and jamb down to fit this shorter than standard opening to be tedious and slow going. In the end, it did fit though, so I was really happy about that. I can now cut the wall panels for this end of the extension. I'll cut a section from this panel for a small access door. This door will allow me to slide long boards from the wall lumber racks on the east-facing wall. This will make it easier to pull these boards straight out instead of trying to navigate through the steel door. I'll temporarily screw this panel in place while I work out how this small door will fit. I made a small frame from 2x2s and will cut a shallow dado for the hinges. And I can fine-tune that, then clamp the hinges and door frame in place while I drill pilot holes and run in some screws. This part of the project I was making up as I went along. I didn't have a finished idea of how this small access door would work. I just wanted it to be inconspicuous and for the hinges to fit somewhere in a groove of the siding panel. And I can check the fit of the panel on the door frame. Once I was happy with this, I pulled off the panels to tack on the tar paper to the wall studs. Then the panels went back on permanently. There's a thin strip of siding on the corner of the extension that I'll add next. And finally, some siding around the door jamb. My roofing supplier bent up some flashing to cover the ends of the panels. I'll test the fit after I cut it to length. I added some butyl tape before running in the screws. And I'll repeat that on the other end of the shed extension. The door trim is next, and I cut and painted the pieces, hammered in some finishing nails, then caulked all the edges. And that's it. Thanks for watching. Have a look at this video here, and we'll see you next time.